The year was 1964. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were beginning their first U.S. tour. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed and became the law of the land, and the United States began bombing North Vietnam. Ford Motor Company released the Mustang with a recommended retail price of under $2,300, and a new toy hit the shelves, the G.I. Joe action figure, not a doll. Quietly on Dartmouth University, two professors created BASIC, computer programming language. This computer programming language would become the most popular language in computing history. BASIC was invented by John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz in 1964. BASIC is actually an acronym standing for Beginners, All-Purpose, Symbolic Instruction Code. Kemeny and Kurtz saw a need for a computing language that was easier to use for beginning programmers. Up until this time, on most college campuses, ALGOL and Fortran were the predominant languages used for programming. While these programming languages were very powerful, they were geared towards math and science students, and consequently they had a very steep learning curve. In A Basic History of BASIC by John Szczepanik, Kemeny stated that he wanted to make programming assistance for students without a science background, because those students often became future decision makers and business leaders. While working on BASIC, Kurtz and Kemeny had several goals they wanted to meet. First, they wanted the language to be general purpose. They wanted to be easy to use, expandable, and interactive. They also wanted to offer debugging help, be efficient, and hardware and operating system independent. They accomplished this in several ways. First, they borrowed the best features from Fortran and ALGOL. Next, commands and statements were in plain English. This gave the beginning and novice programmer an intuitive sense of what the language and what the commands were going to do without even having to know what they really did. Also, the syntax was simple, no longer where you need the commas and the colons associated with other languages. Lastly, BASIC required line numbers. Remember, at this time in 1964, there was no screen editors. Give an example of this. If we were typing a Word document and we wanted to change a line 4 lines up, all we had to do was toggle up or toggle down to the correct line and then edit the line however we wish to edit it. This couldn't be done at that time. By having line numbers in BASIC, the beginning programmer was able to go back to that specific line by merely typing in a line number with the correct changes, and they fixed it. This is something that was wonderful for beginning programmers, novice programmers, because most initial programs were full of bugs and had to be debugged. As you can see, these are the list of the 15 basic command statements in BASIC at the time. And this is from the 1964 catalog from Dartmouth. You can see some of these commands are let, read, data, print. You can immediately get an idea of what these commands are going to do. You don't even have to know what they are, but you get an idea of what they're going to do. That made it much simpler for a beginning programmer. As a result of their work, BASIC became very successful. In the 1999 article, Kemeny and Kurtz developed BASIC, a friendly computing language. The author states that by the fall of 1964, students are being taught BASIC in class and are learning to program in about 2 weeks. And this is an amazing time frame because in April, BASIC was released, and by October it's being taught in classes. And that's just a really quick time frame. Besides its design features, it's important to mention several things that contributed to BASIC's success. First was time sharing. With the advent of time sharing computing, many users were able to use a computer at the same time. Coinciding with BASIC's being put forth into Dartmouth College, GE was also installing timeshare computers there. Those computers, they liked BASIC so much that they installed it on their computers and wrote versions of it for their computers they installed elsewhere in the country, hence spreading BASIC even further than it would have naturally progressed. Another reason BASIC spread so quickly was that it was free of charge. It was not licensed. This was a feature that both Kurtz and Kemeny wanted for the program. They wanted to spread quickly. In A Basic History of Computing, Kurtz states, Dartmouth always took the point of view that what we did was public. Thus, we never made any attempt to control or direct our research. Shortly after, probably by the next year, they were giving away versions of BASIC to local area high schools. And this was a great idea because by the time these students matriculated on the college or out in the business world, they were already familiar and using the BASIC programming language. Lastly, one of the greatest reasons BASIC expanded as quickly as it did was because of games. Early in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a computing magazine called Creative Computing, and they would actually print out computer code for games. These games were then copied down by users and hobbyists for their personal computers. 1973, a man named David All compiled a lot of these games, wrote a few of his own, and put them into a book called, you guessed it, 101 Basic Computing Games. This book was so successful that it became the first book on computing to sell over 1 million copies. BASIC had huge growth throughout the 60s and early 80s. In 1975, Bill Gates and Paul Allen saw an opportunity and sold Ed Roberts a version of BASIC for the Altair 8800. The Apple II computer shipped with versions of BASIC, and most home computers, PCs at that time, were shipping with versions of BASIC. Hence, when you turn them on, you got the little ready prompt. In conclusion, almost 50 years later, the computing industry is a $1 trillion-a-year industry. And you have to admit that BASIC has had a major part in that, or at least been there the whole way. According to Paul Ceruzzi in A History of Modern Computing, BASIC became one of the most widely used computer programming languages in the world. It still is used a lot. Most computers have a version of BASIC on them. Microsoft Visual Basic is still a very popular programming language. However, in the last decade or so, BASIC has waned a lot in its importance. A lot of this has to do with specific software applications like spreadsheets. BASIC was written so that users could perform some of the functions that software like spreadsheets do automatically. Hence, there was lack of a need for it. There is still some use of BASIC by hobbyists, and there are still a lot of websites, different versions of BASIC out there. All in all, you still have to admit that the contributions that BASIC and its inventors, Kemeny and Kurtz, have made to the computing industry are great. Thank you very much.